Hello, I am Jamie Buckland with the West Virginia Few Families United for Education, and I am talking today with Dr. Robert Jackson of Great Hearts out in Phoenix, Arizona. So I just want to thank you so much for taking this time to talk with our audience today. And I wanted to get started, if you could just introduce us to you, your work, and tell us a little bit about how you got started with Great Hearts.
You bet. Well, thank you, Jamie. It is a pleasure to be joining you and your audience there in West Virginia. We've heard a number of good things. We even had visits from the Cardinal Institute, which has been doing good work in your area.
Yes.
This past spring at our event, which we can talk about a little bit more in a minute.
Sure.
But in terms of backstory, let me just tell you that I came to classical education honestly, by which I mean I started out as an educationist, taking coursework and graduate study in a college, a university that was at the Research One level. Florida State was a great place for me to get started, and I had a couple of courses there that explored the historical origins. But it really was in my work at the collegiate level after I had finished up graduate study where I really went deeper and began to explore the tradition, the historical and philosophical tradition that we refer to as classical education. So I spent a dozen years at the King's College in Manhattan, in New York City there. And that little college, which was just getting restarted in the early 2000s, was the place where I was permitted lots of latitude to offer coursework around classical education. Of course, at that point, I thought it was kind of a throwback, that it was something that had all but been overlooked. And so we were doing something rather fundamentally going back to the roots, radical. But essentially, I was unaware of the work that was taking place out in the desert, the Sonoran Desert of Arizona in Phoenix, which I would discover at the introduction of one of my students, getting ready to graduate, looking for work, was interested in the classroom teaching. And he'd made contact with a school leader who was interviewing him. And that student introduced me to the gentleman who would eventually introduce me to Great Hearts and bring me out to see the work. So after several of my students from the King's College began applying and were accepted as teachers, I just became fascinated by what was happening in this charter organization. It was a group of charter schools based in Phoenix known as Great Hearts Academies. And so little by little, I think essentially my calling card would have been the students who came into the classroom and did well here in Phoenix. I was approached by the co-founder, Dan Scoggin, to consider joining Great Hearts. And I did so 9 years ago, working in academics, developing curriculum and professional development. And then just 4 years ago, we propped up what is known as the Great Hearts Institute. It's been referred to as the Institute for Classical Education, but we've used the moniker and have the Great Hearts Institute as our name today. And for the past 4 years, we've done work to promote scholarship and research, to develop professional level expert PD, professional development, and to develop and essentially foster a community, a network, right, of classical education that begins with the 40 schools that are Great Hearts Academies across 2 states, soon to be 3 states, but then is inviting very much an open door to our friends and colleagues from across the country. Because the Institute, the Great Hearts Institute, is a project to focus on how we deepen and improve and give greater clarity to the expression, to how we express and how we convey classical education to the next generation. That's our mission and purpose. And we're going to do that with research and scholarship, but we're going to do that by creating a genuine solidarity among all of those involved in classical education nationwide.
I love it. That is wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And so when I showed up in Phoenix in 2019.
Mhm.
I was coming out. I can't even remember exactly how I learned about the symposium, but that was the inaugural symposium. That was the first
That's right.
one
That's right.
in 2019. And so I learned about that. And this homeschooling mother from Southern West Virginia that was trying to start up a classical hybrid homeschooling program here in the southern part of the state. I just wanted to come out and kind of be a fly on the wall and see what you all were doing. And I was one of a handful of homeschoolers who were
Yep.
out there. And it was an interesting time because in West Virginia, we had this school choice expansion movement happening, largely because of the work of the Cardinal Institute. And I get out there at Great Hearts and realize that you all had kind of been born of this movement
Mhm.
with homeschoolers and charter schools. So, can you tell a little bit about how Great Hearts Academies got started there in Arizona?
You bet. You bet. Well, Great Hearts is a model premised on a prep school design of liberal arts education that ran originally grades 7 to 12. And the focus was to provide genuine classical liberal arts education that would include math and science, languages, beginning with Latin in the middle grades and working through secondary school, that it would have a complete array of coursework that you would expect in all of the major subject areas, but it would also emphasize the focus on a Socratic exploration of great works, great texts, great books. It would do that systematically in the high school experience, beginning with an American focus and then moving into antiquity. But ultimately, it would leave students with the capacity to engage in the tradition, to understand that they are the inheritors or the recipients, right, of a legacy of thought, of intellectual life, but also, and very importantly, that intellectual life stirs in them an understanding of their moral responsibility, of their commitment to their place, to their nation, to their family and community. So this combination of intellectual academic excellence alongside of genuine great-heartedness, right, was the model that was deployed back in 2002. So it's been 20 years ago now with our first school, which itself was built and essentially a replication of a charter model that had been deployed in Tempe, still in existence today, Tempe Prep. And seeing that model, watching the families who responded so well to it, seeing the capacity that school had to really produce excellence and achievement in students, not to mention just the community that was formed around it. The Great Hearts board and the co-founder I mentioned, Dan Scoggin, Jay Heiler, who today sits as our CEO, those gentlemen and a handful of others really produced the very first school known as Veritas Prep with 120 students, preparatory school model, as I said, and they had the vision to reproduce what they had seen at Tempe multiple times. Veritas was the first, but within a couple of years, we had Chandler Prep. A few years later, Glendale. And so by the time I arrived in 2013, there were 16 schools in the Valley of the Sun, Phoenix, and they were serving 7,000 students. Again, that prep school model was what started things. Within a couple of years, by 2010, the leadership recognized we could do even more if we are able to produce lower schools, elementary grades that will lead up into and feed that prep school program. And so as of 2010, we began offering the full K-12 experience within Great Hearts Academies. And I guess I just want to emphasize, Jamie, that the form was really born out of families, both at Tempe and then at that first school, Veritas, who were so committed to the classical model, so given to understanding that this is a better way, this is a better form for the preparation of our young, that without that kind of solid base, that sort of the family base, I don't think that these schools would have really gotten off the ground. So I want to give kind of that shout or that recognition, those kudos to the families that gave birth to Veritas and eventually to multiple communities. And today, as I said, we have 40 schools now. Beyond Phoenix, we're in San Antonio and Fort Worth and Dallas, and next year we'll be in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So the growth continues, but it's always premised on a solid foundation of families, right, who are committed to a better form of education for their children.
It's amazing in when you consider the different sectors, if you will, of education. If we look back, I've been home educating now for 15 years. So I'm headed into I guess I'm in my 16th year of homeschooling. But when I got in this game, especially in West Virginia, it was public school, private school, homeschool. The lines were pretty clearly defined.
Mm-hmm.
And I was I was comfortable with that. And when I was in Phoenix, I was, of course, introduced to this charter movement, which was completely foreign to me. And I got to speak with educators who were working there with Great Hearts, charter school teachers who were there for teacher training at the symposium. And they were talking about their work leading up to that. They were homeschoolers. So they were homeschooling families that had come into this model. So I want to hear more about how you've been able to branch out now just from that charter movement. You guys are launching online programs through this virtual work. And so I want to hear more about what Great Hearts is doing to keep up with what some may call a trend. But for those of us who believe we're in the tradition, we're trying to not get too trendy, right? We're trying to embrace what we love about what is true, good, and beautiful, but keep up and stay relevant with what families are looking for. So can you talk a little bit about how your work is evolving in response to this demand?
Yeah, there's no question that the demand drives our work. I will point back to those visionaries from the early 2000s who thought, wouldn't it be great if we can just put together 4, maybe 5 schools here in the Phoenix metropolitan area? That would be incredible. There's no way, people, naysayers, you won't get any demand for that. Well, clearly, 27,000 students later and several thousand on the wait list, there is demand. And so to your question, what Great Hearts has begun to do is explore how the success of our schools can be parlayed into something of a resource bank, an opportunity whereby we are, both with the symposium, with the Great Hearts Institute as a resource clearinghouse, the research that we're trying to conduct internally, how we can go out and say to other communities across this country, would you like something of this sort, right? Are you interested in this model? If they are, we do now have online schools both in Arizona and Texas. So they're based there in those states, but have begun to explore and just launched essentially a hybrid model that works in tandem with the homeschooling family to build out, based on a sort of a backbone of the online program, a series of resources, or a set of resources rather, that are going to be available to the local community. And that local community is essentially run or supported by an entrepreneur, really, on the ground, someone in the locale who says, I want to see that model. I think there's a sufficient demand in my community or among the families that I know at my church or at my synagogue, perhaps a part of some other group, social civic group that I'm part of. But I think if there's enough demand, I'm ready, with the help of Great Hearts Online and a support mechanism around this hybrid model, to launch one of these in my neighborhood. So that's actually a new development in the past year and a half that Great Hearts has undertaken because of the incredible demand and the recognition on our part, we can't prop schools up quick enough, right? Again, as I told you, we'll be in Baton Rouge next year and the year after in Jacksonville, Florida. But the bottom line is to prop up a school takes a couple of years minimum. The charter application in our case, obviously all the groundwork that's done locally, you can't move that fast. Whereas homeschooling families are really nimble. They can pivot on a dime. They know what they want. And if they see something that they like, they can put it into practice essentially the next day.
And
So
they're used to operating that way. And
that's
so
right.
when you partner with homeschooling families, I like to say we can be a little intense, which I'm sure you've learned. But when you're used to not having to work around bureaucracy, you do kind of get in this, you get those blinders on where when someone says, oh, well, it could take some time, we tend to think, well, why? What can we do to improve upon it? And we tend to be a little more comfortable with risk than maybe some others. And so we're just kind of willing to do that. So it's kind of neat for me to look back on my introduction to Great Hearts and to the symposium, and to now see you guys spreading into this space and partnering with homeschoolers in this way to serve communities, because I do know I felt like I was quite the pioneer here in Southern West Virginia, trying to just help people wrap their brain around the difference in educating classically. So if we can pivot into that, I would love to get your insight on how you try to kind of paint the picture for families, for educators, when we're looking at the difference in pedagogies, if you will, and we're seeing an emphasis on STEM, or we're seeing an emphasis on the arts specifically, as would be known in dance or painting. And so how do we look at the liberal arts, at that holistic approach, and how do we help families understand the differences in those, the distinctions, and kind of how to paint that picture without necessarily, when you're in a market like Southern West Virginia, we don't necessarily have a classical school on the corner to point them to show, well, this is what they're doing over there. So how do we paint that picture for those who maybe can't wrap their brain around it?
Well, I think a lot of what we are advocating or propagating within classical education is something that will probably be familiar to families if we talk at the level of that which they hold dear. Many of the families who are homeschooling, home educating, obviously recognize the importance of faith and their faith tradition as grounded in Holy Scripture, as founded within a church community, as the recognition of passing along the faith, right, from generation to generation, is at least analogous to our commitment in classical education to essential readings, cultural literacy, as it's been referenced. There are great works that stem back more than 2,500 years that any educated person deserves to know. Certainly, the communities, the families that you're probably representing and that you've worked with would acknowledge that in reference to something like the Bible, but would they recognize that in terms of the great philosophers of antiquity, and specifically, from the Greek period, the Hellenistic period? Would they understand that our form of government is something that has been, that was composed under the influence of antiquity, especially under the understanding of the Roman Republic, of the early Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Montesquieu and others who gave shape to the founding? So I think for many of your families who would want to hold dear things like faith and national genuine patriotism, a patriotism that is sort of wide eyes open, right? We know that we're not perfect, but we certainly are the last best hope, as Lincoln put it. And as such, we really want to lay emphasis on things that are timeless or perennial, that deserve our recognition, deserve even our respect as we pass this along as a tradition. So I would say, first off, it's those truths that we hold, as Jefferson said, to be self-evident. We're trying to convey those to the next generation. And that's, as I think in the public square today, and certainly in mass media, these things are up for grabs. These things are sort of constantly being, pot shots are being taken. There are a lot of sort of resentful and cynical attitudes towards things that we hold up as dear and to be respected. That would be the first thing. The second thing I mentioned it was implied in some of my earlier remarks, pertains to just the formation of sentiment, the formation of affections. We want our children, yes, to love our country, and yes, to love that which is holy. We want them to be interested in the life of the mind that, again, is a long-standing tradition, right, that comes down to us. But in so doing, we want them to become good people. Every survey that I see, and it doesn't matter, it's not a politically biased thing, because again, I don't think this should be a partisan affair. I think classical education should focus on the fact that families, parents want their children to have a good life. They want them to become good people. Well, to do that requires intentionality. It requires that those who are entrusted to teach and educate, beginning with the parents, those who are entrusted to teach and educate take seriously the moral development of the child, that the child knows that there are ways in which he or she can choose to become virtuous or vicious, and that compass needle is always twitching, right? Always twitching. So that emphasis on moral development, character, and virtue, central to the classical model. And again, I think most families would see that. They would know that. They would recognize that intuitively. But the third thing, and you hinted at it, would be the fact that we're building and cultivating students to make beautiful things, to express themselves eloquently, right? To think clearly, but to express themselves in language that is truly elevated. We want, in a rather crass culture, to carve out a space, almost a sacred space, where students can recognize there are higher things and I want to speak of them and I want to imitate those who have spoken well. But not just speaking, we want them making, producing culture, making the art, making the music and the song that gives expression to our heart. There are ways in which the art in our schools, and I'm sure the art in your home schools, is perhaps the most telltale or signature item in our curriculum. So what you're hearing me say is that I think parents would understand truth seeking is in fact central to the education that we're offering as a classical model. Goodness, or the cultivation of human goodness, is essential. It's not to be divorced from intellectual activity, which is itself a good, right? But it must be sought for its own sake. But finally, that we're trying to develop an aesthetic. Now, that's a fancy word, but it means that students will have an eye and an ear for that which is beautiful, and they will make those things and hopefully renew or otherwise engage with our culture in a way that will bring about a more beautiful future. So that's truth, goodness, and beauty, effectively, you've heard me articulate. And I think most parents, if we get down into it and start talking at that level, they will acknowledge the value of those things and the desire to bring those to their students, to their children.
Right. In my work, I get to kind of wear a couple of different hats and juggle a couple of different roles. So just yesterday, I'm actually in the classroom working with students at our 1 day a week tutorial here in West Virginia. And I like to stay close to that because it reminds me of the work on the ground that we're doing with the families and with the students. But then I do get to work with with my peers, other group leaders who are running similar programs. I get to talk with the policy wonks, if you will, who are writing the policy to try to expand the options and increase the funding and the vehicles that allow us to do this, and to work with those who are trying to figure out, where are we going to hold these micro schools? Where are we going to find the facilities that we need to actually host these programs? And when I think about that, I think about the infrastructure and the support that is needed. And when I think about Great Hearts and their impact on my work over the last few years, I think about how you all are connecting those of us on the ground to a support system through your research, through your materials, through the work that you're doing, the interviews that you all are doing, and what you're putting out, and with the symposium. So what should we be looking for right now for those of us on the ground? You know, it's hard to do all of those steps as an individual.
Sure.
It's kind of my niche. But for those who are kind of looking to Great Hearts to kind of keep us abreast of what's happening, what do you guys have planned in these next few months? I know there's something big in early 2023. So what can we be looking to for Great Hearts for support for those of us doing the work?
You bet. Well, and I want to reiterate the fact that I do believe it's the folks on the ground, just as you put it, that it's the families behind these young people that are making all the difference. We are very, very pleased to say, and you'll hear us repeatedly at Great Hearts say, the parents are the very first educators of those young people that have been entrusted to us in the school. But what we're going to do as we continue to grow at Great Hearts is provide more resourcing. We're essentially using the Institute as a kind of a front porch, right? Or, a showcase, a window, right, into the work that we're doing. And it's easy to find. If you can remember Great Hearts, and then you can put a .institute, that's the website right there, greathearts.institute.
Right.
What you'll see today there on the website gives you some indication of what we're doing and how this growth may affect folks on the ground. First of all, the promotion of and the development of real community. So connecting people, just as we're trying to do here today, is an essential part of what we are up to. You will see very quickly, if you get to that website, a map where we have included every classical school that we've been able to identify, more than 800 nationwide. What I have yet to do, Jamie, but maybe with your help and the help of a few others, is place hybrid schools and the micro schools that are popping up. They're popping up so quickly, I can't even keep up,
Right.
but I'm ready to try.
Yes.
To try. So we'll place those on the map so that if you're looking to connect and you're in some region, some space, some part of these United States where we just haven't been able to prop up a school yet, we need to get you close to somebody who has, right? And if that's happening, we want you to know about it. That's the first thing. I would say our publications, the Virtue Magazine, as we've entitled it, comes out quarterly, and it's available free of charge. So all that you need to do is jump on to the website and opt in, put your name and your email there, let us know of your interests. We're essentially doing the kind of thing that you and I are doing right here, which is canvassing the wider world of classical and bringing that into the pages of this. It's a short form, 16 to 20 page magazine. It's a way for us to highlight both the work that we're doing within the schools at Great Hearts, but also to take stock of the wider movement. Because in part, due to our growth, you have seen a number of players, a number of providers come online, beginning with institutions of higher education that now offer training in graduate level training for teachers and or home educators. There are a number of entrepreneurs that have started up training programs that they offer both in schools and online. So I'm thinking here of examples like Cana Academy, the various small group or Scholé type models that are supportive of homeschoolers and co-ops. But anyhow, those groups are the types that will be we're trying to connect them to folks on the ground to make sure that you know where those resources are located. So there's a resource section of our website, the greathearts.institute website, where folks can go and explore both what Great Hearts has on offer, but you can also look within the community section to see the various institutions and organizations who are partnering with us. They're with us at the national event, the National Symposium each spring, but they're also continuing to do their work year round. So I strongly encourage any family that's seriously thinking about classical to begin by reading, and there's much to be explored here, reading some of the sort of standard texts, if you will, that introduce the classical model, and then just talking with and actually making connection to those who are in the work. Get as close as you can to somebody who's in classical education in your neighborhood or in your region, and begin to explore how they've gone about building something for their children in the next generation.
Yes. And then tell us what is to be expected. Is it the end of February? Do I have my dates right?
That's right. It's February 22, 23, 24. We have, I could say, an all-star cast already. If you go and take a look, the symposium is one of the prominent headliners or menu items. Just click on Symposium on the Great Hearts Institute website. You'll be taken straight to that symposium site where you can see all of the speakers. We have more than 30 currently lined up. We will have a series of talks from the experts. We will have workshops both for lower and upper school grades. And we'll have a leadership track that will include heads of school, board members, philanthropists, policymakers like our friends at the Cardinal Institute, all of whom will be addressing the question of how do we sustain this movement? How do we make sure that the roots go down deep and that classical education is here for 100, 200 years? We want to think in terms of centuries, right, Jamie? We want to make sure that this is going to be going long after we're gone.
Yes,
so,
and I love that. I love at the symposium, I want to say this, one thing that I feel was truly beneficial was the connection to this scholarly research I believe, is it Dr. Williamson of Virginia that presented at that inaugural symposium on reading back in 2019. I believe it was
Willingham. That's right.
Thank you.
Daniel
Thank
Willingham
you.
from the University of Virginia. That's right.
Yes. And so just to be able to hear from speakers like that as a homeschool mom, I think, again, that's part of the connection work that Great Hearts is doing that is so essential to that infrastructure. So to those who may be watching or listening, I want to encourage you to consider making the trip out to Phoenix there in February. And you guys are taking registrations now. So that's something we can get on the calendar and make happen. Well, in wrapping up, I have a question.
Sure.
What are you reading?
Well, right now I've gone back to one of my favorites and I'm exploring further his work. Two things. So I've always got sort of a philosophic text over here on my right hand, and then a literary or imaginative literary work on my left. On the right hand, I'm going back to Owen Barfield's work. Now, your listeners and viewers may not have heard of him, but they will have heard of C.S. Lewis and perhaps of the Inklings. He was in that inner circle of true friends, friends of virtue, as Aristotle said. He was a philosopher, he was a lawyer, but he was just a great mind. And he has some thoughts that I think are truly pertinent to how we're affecting this classical model. So Owen Barfield, his Poetic Diction and Saving the Appearances. I've read Poetic Diction. I'm just starting the Saving the Appearances, really speak to the nature of language and how language conveys thought, and how we think more clearly, but always more metaphorically. So I'll leave it at that. That's my philosopher. And then I've got my great imaginative literature with a new find for me, Paul Horgan. Paul Horgan's a 20th century writer. He was a historian, or at least he wrote histories of the Southwest in particular. But he was also a great novelist, a prolific novelist, and short story author. So I would recommend to your listeners, anybody who wants to pick up Paul Horgan will be just delighted with, I think he must have 50 or 60 short stories that will just rivet the reader. They're just fantastic. So.
Okay, well, that's always my burning question when I talk to another educator. I like to know what we're reading to keep us on this journey of learning. So thank you so much, Robert, for your time today. And I look forward to seeing you in Phoenix. I'm planning on making the trip, so I'm looking forward to seeing you then.
We'll see you then, Jamie. And thanks for this time today.
Thank you so much.